In episode 29, titled Web Enumeration, Content and Paths, we're going to focus on how finding paths reveals hidden functionality worth testing, and how to do that mapping in a way that stays controlled and phase appropriate. Pen Test Plus scenarios often hint at a web target with a handful of observed routes, redirects, or page behaviors. Then ask what you should do next to build understanding safely. Web enumeration is the phase where you turn "there is a web app" into "here are the pages, endpoints, and inputs that actually matter," without jumping ahead into exploit thinking. The goal is to identify where functionality lives, where identity boundaries exist, and where sensitive workflows concentrate, because those are the places where risk tends to show up. This is also a phase where discipline matters, because it is easy to get lost in endless paths and forget the objective. By the end, you should be able to describe a structured approach that maps content, classifies risk surfaces, and records boundaries for later validation. Web enumeration can be described plainly as mapping pages, endpoints, and input locations so you understand what the application exposes and how users and roles interact with it. You are collecting a functional inventory, not just a set of URLs, because the purpose is to identify workflows and boundaries that matter. Pages and endpoints represent actions and resources such as account management, data retrieval, uploads, and administrative functions, and enumerating them gives you a picture of what the application can do. Input locations include parameters, forms, and request bodies, which are where validation and control questions will later focus, but in enumeration, you are mainly identifying where those inputs exist. This phase also includes learning how the application responds to normal and abnormal requests, which can hint at access control enforcement and error handling behavior. On the exam, the correct next step after noticing a web application often involves expanding this map in a controlled way rather than selecting an aggressive action. When you treat enumeration as building a map, your next actions become clearer and more defensible.
Directory and file patterns are useful because they often signal where sensitive functionality might be hiding, even before you interact deeply. Paths that suggest admin functionality deserve attention because they often concentrate privileged actions, but the presence of an admin-like name is a hint, not proof that the route is privileged or reachable.
Backup-like or old-like patterns can indicate leftover artifacts, which can increase exposure if they leak code, configuration, or data, but you should treat them as sensitive evidence points rather than as curiosities to download.
API-like patterns suggest programmatic endpoints where authorization and data handling discipline matter, and staging-like patterns suggest environment boundaries that can be confusing and risky if misinterpreted. The exam expects you to recognize these patterns as prioritization hints, not as automatic vulnerabilities. A professional approach uses these patterns to decide what to classify and validate next while maintaining scope and safety constraints. When you can read path patterns as functional clues, you avoid both tunnel vision and scattershot exploration.
Parameters and forms create input surfaces that matter later, and enumeration is the phase where you identify them and understand their context. A parameter in a URL, a form field in a page, or a structured request body is an interface where user-controlled data can influence application behavior, which is why it becomes central in later validation steps. In enumeration, you are not trying to prove an input weakness. You are cataloging where inputs exist, what kind of data they appear to accept, and what workflows they support. This is important because the same input type can be low risk in one context and high risk in another, depending on what it controls and what role boundaries exist. The exam often tests whether you can spot that an application has multiple input points and choose the one that aligns with the objective and likely impact. A disciplined enumerator records inputs with their surrounding context rather than collecting random parameters without meaning. When you understand inputs as surfaces tied to workflows, your mapping becomes actionable.
Authentication boundaries are one of the most important outputs of web enumeration because they define what is public, what is protected, and how roles differ in what they can reach. Public routes reveal what any user can see without identity, and they often include entry points like login and marketing content, but they can also include data exposure if misconfigured.
Protected routes reveal what requires authentication, which helps you map what a normal user can do versus what a privileged user can do, and those differences often contain the most meaningful access control questions.
Role differences are critical because many web risks are authorization risks, where one role can reach another role's data or actions through flawed enforcement.
In exam scenarios, the prompt may imply role boundaries through small cues, such as standard user versus admin, and your enumeration approach should emphasize discovering which routes are tied to which roles.
You do not need to break anything to learn a lot about boundaries. Observing what is accessible and what is denied can be enough to classify surfaces. When you map boundaries clearly, you set yourself up for safer and more focused validation later.
Status codes and redirects can hint at access control behavior, and learning to interpret them is part of web enumeration maturity.
Redirects can indicate that the application is guiding users to login flows, identity gateways, or default routes, which can reveal where session and authentication boundaries are enforced.
Status codes can indicate whether a route exists, whether it is blocked, whether access is denied, or whether the application is behaving in a way that leaks information about what is behind the boundary.
The key is that these signals are not purely technical. They are behavioral evidence about how the application enforces control and how it reveals structure. On the exam, you may see a scenario where a route returns a different status depending on authentication state, and the question is often asking you to recognize the implied boundary and choose a phase-appropriate next step.
You should treat these signals as part of your map, not as proof of a specific vulnerability, because behavior can be influenced by middleware and configuration.
When you interpret status and redirects carefully, you gain insight without escalating risk. One pitfall is chasing endless paths, because web surfaces can be effectively infinite if you treat enumeration like a scavenger hunt rather than like a purposeful map-building exercise. Another pitfall is missing the most sensitive routes because you spend time on low-value content, which is easy to do when the application has many pages. The exam tests this by presenting options that enumerate broadly without prioritization versus options that focus on high-risk surfaces aligned with the objective. A disciplined approach prioritizes based on what paths imply about functionality and risk, and it respects constraints such as time windows and production sensitivity. Another pitfall is confusing environment routes, such as treating staging-like paths as irrelevant or safe without confirming what they represent, which can lead to wrong conclusions. The goal is to enumerate enough to create a confident picture of key workflows and boundaries, not to enumerate every possible URL. When you keep purpose in mind, you avoid getting lost and you produce more meaningful evidence. Now, imagine a scenario where you discover an admin path, because this is a common exam setup that tests cautious next actions. You observe a path that suggests administrative functionality, and the application's behavior indicates that the route exists but may require authentication or a privileged role. The wrong move is to assume that admin means you should immediately attempt to force access or to treat the discovery as a confirmed vulnerability. The professional next step is to classify the route as likely sensitive, note what access boundary seems to exist, and choose a controlled action that confirms the nature of the boundary without causing disruption. That could involve verifying whether the route is reachable, whether it redirects to a login flow, and what it reveals about access control behavior, all within the rules of engagement. You also document the observation as a finding candidate, not as a proven weakness, because existence is not exposure, and exposure is not exploitation. On Pen Test Plus questions, the correct answer usually reflects controlled confirmation and boundary respect rather than impulsive escalation. Quick wins in web enumeration often come from focusing on a small set of high-value areas that consistently matter across many applications. Login and account management services are high value because they define identity boundaries and are common sources of access control and session behavior issues. Upload areas are high value because they often involve complex input handling and can have high impact if misconfigured, even when you are only enumerating their presence. Data export areas are high value because they represent mass data movement, making them sensitive from a confidentiality and authorization perspective. Account settings and profile functions are also high value because they often reveal how the application handles user-controlled data and identity state. The exam frequently rewards focusing enumeration on these surfaces because it reflects prioritization based on risk and impact rather than on curiosity. This does not mean you ignore other paths, but it means you anchor your effort where value is highest and then expand thoughtfully. When you focus on these quick win areas, your map becomes more actionable with less wasted effort.
As you map content, it is important to note context, especially what requires authentication and what leaks information, because context is what turns a list of paths into a useful security narrative.
You should record which routes appear public, which appear protected, and which appear role-limited, because those distinctions guide later validation choices.
You should also note what information is revealed through behavior, such as whether error messages disclose internal details or whether redirects reveal identity architecture. Information leakage can be subtle, such as differences in response behavior that reveal whether a resource exists even when access is denied, and these signals often matter on the exam.
Context also includes operational constraints, such as whether the application appears to be production, and whether there are signs of sensitivity that should influence how cautiously you proceed. A professional enumerator records boundaries and leakage cues along the path, because that is how the map becomes security relevant.
When your notes include context, your later testing becomes safer and more efficient. Inferring technology from headers and page behavior can be helpful, but it must be done carefully because intermediaries and configuration choices can mislead. Headers can suggest platform families, middleware, or security features, and behavior patterns can hint at frameworks or service types, but these are still clues rather than confirmations. The exam often tests whether you overtrust technology inference by offering an answer that jumps to a specific exploit based on a superficial fingerprint. The better approach is to use technology hints to guide prioritization and to choose safe next steps that confirm identity and boundaries before making strong claims. This is consistent with evidence-based workflow discipline. Infer, then validate, then decide. Technology inference also supports reporting because it helps explain why a certain configuration is risky or why a certain remediation path makes sense, but it should be framed as observed behavior and cautious conclusion.
When you keep inference separate from confirmation, your reasoning stays defensible.
Enumeration results should feed later testing without jumping ahead, and this is where phase discipline protects you from common mistakes. The map you build during enumeration tells you where to validate access controls, where inputs exist, and where sensitive workflows concentrate. But enumeration itself does not prove vulnerabilities. The exam likes to test whether you can stop at the right time, meaning you use enumeration to set up validation rather than slipping into exploit thinking simply because a path looks interesting. A strong workflow uses enumeration outputs to choose targeted validation steps that respect scope, safety, and objectives, such as confirming role boundaries or verifying that sensitive routes are properly protected. This also helps you avoid creating unnecessary noise because you have a clear plan for what to validate next rather than a vague desire to try things. When you keep the phases distinct, your decisions align with professional practice and exam expectations. Enumeration is the map, and validation is the proof, and you need both in the right order. A useful memory anchor for web enumeration is map, classify, prioritize, record boundaries, because it captures the work at a professional level. Map means identify pages, endpoints, and input locations so you understand what exists and how workflows are structured. Classify means decide what each route represents in terms of function and sensitivity, such as authentication-related, administrative, data handling, or public content. Prioritize means focus attention on the highest risk surfaces first, especially login, account, upload, and export areas, rather than chasing endless low-value paths. Record boundaries means document what appears public, what is protected, what is role-limited, and what leaks information through behavior, because boundaries are the real security story. This anchor keeps you from drifting into endless enumeration and keeps you from jumping ahead into exploitation. If you can run this anchor quickly, you can answer many Pentest Plus web workflow questions with confidence. In this episode, the key approach is to treat web enumeration as a structured mapping of content, paths, and input surfaces, with special attention to authentication boundaries and behavioral signals like status codes and redirects. Use directory and file patterns as hints to prioritize likely sensitive functionality, but avoid the pitfall of treating names as proof of exposure or vulnerability. Focus quick wins on login, account, upload, and data export areas because these surfaces concentrate identity and data risk and often shape the most meaningful findings. Record context as you go, noting what requires authentication, what appears role-limited, and what leaks information. And use technology hints cautiously as guidance rather than as certainty. Let enumeration feed later validation by producing a prioritized map, but do not jump ahead into aggressive proof simply because a path looks interesting. Now, mentally map one section of a site you know by identifying a likely login area, a likely account area, and one data handling area, then stating what boundary each implies, because that exercise turns enumeration into a disciplined habit. When your mapping habit is disciplined, web enumeration questions become straightforward evidence organization rather than a guessing game. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.